I thought I was being the perfect mother by giving my son everything he asked for. But when I overheard his phone conversation that night, I discovered the horrifying truth about what he really thought of me. If you are watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. My name is Margaret Chen, but everyone calls me Maggie. At 71 years old, I believed I had raised a son who loved and respected me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was October 10th, David's 38th birthday, and I had spent the entire day preparing his favorite meal. Beef Wellington with roasted vegetables and chocolate mousse cake, the same meal I had made for every one of his birthdays since he turned 16. The dining room table was set with my finest china, the candles were lit, and I was waiting for his arrival. David lived just 20 minutes away in the upscale part of town, in a house I had helped him buy 5 years earlier when his marriage fell apart. $50,000 from my retirement savings had gone toward his down payment, money I had saved over 40 years of working as a school librarian. But seeing my only child happy and secure had been worth every penny. At least that's what I thought then. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30, just as I expected. David was always punctual, a trait he had inherited from his father before he passed away 8 years ago. I hurried to the door, smoothing my apron and checking my reflection in the hallway mirror one last time. When I opened the door, David stood there looking handsome as always. Tall and well-dressed with perfectly styled dark hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly budget. He carried a bottle of expensive wine and wore the gold watch I had given him last Christmas. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, reaching up to hug him. He returned the embrace, but it felt strangely cold and brief. "Thanks, Mum. Something smells amazing in here." He stepped inside and handed me the wine bottle. "This is from that new vineyard downtown. I thought we could try it together." As we walked toward the dining room, I noticed he seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly. When I asked about it, he simply said he was expecting an important call from work. David worked as a marketing executive for a large corporation, though I was never entirely clear on what his job actually involved. Dinner conversation felt forced and awkward. David picked at his food, barely touching the beef Wellington I had spent hours preparing. He kept glancing at his phone, and when it finally rang, he practically jumped from his chair. "I need to take this, Mom. It is really important." He stepped out onto the back patio, sliding the glass door shut behind him. From where I sat at the dining table, I could see him pacing back and forth on the patio, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. At first I tried not to eavesdrop, but something about his body language made me curious. He seemed agitated, almost angry. I moved closer to the patio door, not close enough to be obvious, but near enough that I could hear fragments of his conversation through the glass. What I heard made my blood run cold. No, you do not understand," David was saying, his voice sharp and impatient. "The old woman is becoming a problem. She keeps asking questions about the money." Old woman. Was he talking about me? I pressed closer to the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid he might hear it. "Look, Jessica," David continued, "I have been planning this for 3 years. Ever since Dad died, I have been slowly gaining control of her finances. She trusts me completely, signs whatever I put in front of her." My hands began to shake. Jessica must be his girlfriend, the one he had mentioned casually a few months ago but never brought around to meet me. "The house is almost ready to be transferred into my name. I told her it was for estate planning purposes, to avoid probate taxes when she dies." She believed every word. David laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. The stupid old bat actually thanked me for looking out for her future. I stumbled backward from the door, knocking over a chair in my shock. The noise must have been loud enough for David to hear because he suddenly stopped talking and looked toward the house. I quickly moved back to the dining table and sat down, trying to appear casual as I picked at my barely touched dinner. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard. David slid the patio door open and came back inside, tucking his phone into his pocket. "Sorry about that, Mom. Work emergency. You know how it is." "Course, dear." I managed to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Is everything okay? Just some issues with a client account. Nothing I cannot handle. He sat back down and took a large gulp of wine. This beef Wellington is delicious, by the way. Thank you for going to so much trouble. The compliment felt hollow now. Meaningless words spoken by someone who had just called me a stupid old bat to his girlfriend. I watched him cut another piece of meat. His movements casual and relaxed, as if he had not just shattered my world with a single phone conversation. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. David chatted about work, about the weather, about anything except the fact that he was systematically stealing my life savings. When he finally left around 9 o'clock, he hugged me goodbye and told me he loved me. The words felt like poison in my ears. I love you too, sweetheart, I heard myself say, the lie burning my throat as it came out. After he left, I stood in my kitchen staring at the dirty dishes, trying to make sense of what had happened. This was my son, the baby I had carried for 9 months, the toddler who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager I had stayed up all night helping with college applications. When had he become this stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome? I spent the next 3 days in a fog of disbelief and heartbreak. Every time my phone rang, I hoped it would be David calling to apologize, to tell me there had been some horrible misunderstanding. Instead, the calls were from telemarketers and doctors' offices confirming appointments. On the 4th day, I finally gathered enough courage to look through the financial documents David had helped me organize over the past 3 years. What I found made me physically sick. My savings account, which had contained nearly $200,000 after Harold died, now showed a balance of less than $30,000. My checking account had been changed to joint ownership with David as the primary account holder. Even my certificate of deposit investments had been transferred to accounts I did not recognize. Most devastating of all was the deed to my house. The home Harold and I had bought 35 years ago, where we had raised David, where we had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays, was no longer in my name. According to the paperwork I found in my filing cabinet, I had apparently signed ownership over to David 6 months ago. I did not remember signing any such document. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers and tried to remember the day David had brought these documents over. He had explained them so carefully, using words like estate planning and tax benefits and protecting my assets. I had trusted him completely. Why would I not trust my own son? The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was no longer the owner of my own home. David could throw me out at any time, and there would be nothing I could do about it. I was completely at his mercy, and he had made it clear that he saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved. My hands shook as I reached for the phone. I needed help, but who could I call? My sister lived across the country, and we had not spoken in months after a silly argument about mom-old recipes. My closest friends were either dead or in nursing homes themselves. The neighbors were friendly but not close enough to burden with this kind of family drama. That is when I remembered Ruth Patterson. Ruth had been my co-worker at the elementary school library for 15 years before we both retired. She was sharp, practical, and had dealt with her own family financial drama when her nephew tried to steal her late husband's pension. If anyone would know what to do, it would be Ruth. I called her number, praying she would answer. Margaret. Ruth's voice was warm and surprised. I was just thinking about you. How are you doing? Ruth, I need help. Something terrible has happened. I told her everything. The overheard phone conversation, the missing money, the house deed, the 3 years of documents I apparently signed without understanding their true purpose. By the time I finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Oh honey, she finally said, her voice heavy with sympathy. This is elder financial abuse. It happens more often than people realize, and sadly it is usually family members who do it. What can I do? I asked, surprised by how small and helpless my voice sounded. First, you need to gather all the documents you can find. Every bank statement, every legal paper, everything David ever asked you to sign. Then you need to call an attorney who specializes in elder law. And Margaret, you need to be very careful. If David realizes you are onto him, There is no telling what he might do. The warning sent chills down my spine. Was my own son dangerous? Would he hurt me to protect his scheme? Ruth gave me the name and number of an attorney she had used during her own family crisis. Patricia Williams had helped Ruth recover most of the money her nephew had stolen and had seen dozens of cases like mine. I called Patricia's office first thing the next morning and was able to get an appointment for that afternoon. As I drove downtown to her office, I felt like I was heading to my own execution. Once I took this step, there would be no going back. My relationship with David would be destroyed forever. But then I remembered his words from that phone conversation. The stupid old bat. He had already destroyed our relationship. I just had not known it yet. Patricia Williams was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head. Mrs. Chen, I have to tell you, this is one of the most systematic cases of financial elder abuse I have seen. Your son did not just take advantage of your grief after your husband died. He planned this carefully over a period of years. Is there anything I can do? Yes. We can challenge every document you signed. We can argue that you were not competent to make these decisions due to grief and emotional manipulation. We can file for financial elder abuse and possibly criminal charges. But I need to warn you about something. What is that? Once we start this process, your relationship with David will be over. Family court cases like this destroy families permanently. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the David I had raised. The son who used to bring me flowers on Mother's Day and call me every Sunday just to check in. Then I thought about the David I had overheard on the phone, the one who called me a stupid old bat and was planning to steal everything I had worked for. Mrs. Williams, what relationship? He has already decided I do not matter. Then let us make sure you matter very much. Patricia explained the legal process. We would need to gather evidence, document the financial manipulation, and prove that I was mentally competent to manage my own affairs despite what David might claim. It would take weeks or months, and it would be expensive. The most important thing right now is that David does not realize you know what he has done. Can you continue to act normal around him while we build our case? Thought about it. Could I smile and pretend everything was fine while secretly documenting my son's betrayal? Could I hug him goodbye and tell him I loved him while knowing he was stealing from me? Yes, I said finally. Can do that. But I also want to ask you about recording conversations. This is a single-party consent state, which means you can legally record any conversation you are part of. Do you think David might incriminate himself if you got him talking about his plans? The idea terrified and thrilled me at the same time. What if I could get David to admit what he was doing? What if I could prove beyond any doubt that he was stealing from me? Think so. He has been trying to get me to sign more papers. Maybe I could record that conversation. Patricia handed me a small digital recorder, no bigger than a thumb drive. Just press this button to start recording. The battery lasts for hours and the sound quality is excellent. But Mrs. Chen, be very careful. If David suspects you are recording him, he might become desperate. That night David called to check on me. His voice was warm and caring, exactly the way it had always been before I discovered the truth. Hi Mom, just wanted to see how you are doing. You seemed a little quiet at dinner the other night. I am fine, sweetheart. Just feeling a bit overwhelmed by all these financial things lately. Actually, that is perfect timing. I have been meaning to talk to you about some updates we need to make to your accounts. Can I come over tomorrow evening? There are some papers you need to sign. My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. Course, honey. What time works for you? How about 7 o'clock? I will bring dinner from that Chinese place you like. Even in his betrayal, David was still thoughtful enough to bring my favorite food. The contradiction made my chest ache with a pain so deep I could barely breathe. That sounds wonderful. I will see you tomorrow. After I hung up, I sat in Harold's old chair and cried. I cried for the son I had lost, for the trust that had been broken, for the naive woman I had been who believed that being a good mother would guarantee having a loving child. But when I was done crying, I dried my eyes and started planning. Tomorrow night, David would finally tell me the truth about what he was doing to me. And this time I would have proof. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. I kept checking the digital recorder Patricia had given me, making sure I knew how to use it properly. I practiced acting natural, pretending I did not know what David was up to. By the time evening arrived, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. David arrived at exactly 7 o'clock carrying bags of Chinese takeout and wearing his most charming smile. He looked so much like his father at that age, with the same dark eyes and easy manner that had made me fall in love with Harold all those years ago. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked as we unpacked the food at the kitchen table. "Quiet. I spent some time looking through those financial papers you helped me organize last year. Some of them are confusing to me." David's expression did not change, but I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern. Annoyance. What kind of confusion? Maybe I can help explain things. I pressed the record button on the device hidden in my cardigan pocket and took a deep breath. "Well, I was looking at my bank statements and it seems like there is a lot less money than I thought there should be. And I found this deed that says the house is in your name now, but I do not remember signing anything like that." David set down his chopsticks and gave me the patient, condescending smile I was starting to recognize. "Mom, we talked about this. Remember when Dad died and there were all those complicated legal issues? I helped you transfer things into my name to avoid probate taxes and make sure everything would be protected if something happened to you. I do not remember it that way." His smile became tighter. "Mom, you were grieving. You were not thinking clearly about financial matters. That is why you asked me to handle everything for you." "I never asked you to handle everything. I asked you to help me understand the paperwork." David leaned forward, his voice taking on that reasonable tone adults use when talking to confused children. "Mom, I think you need to face some hard truths about your memory. You have been forgetting things lately. Important things. Last week you called me 3 times asking the same question about your doctor appointment. That was not true, but I could see where this was heading." David was building a case for my incompetence, creating a narrative that would justify everything he had done. "I have not been forgetting things, David. I remember everything perfectly clearly, including the phone conversation you had on my patio last week." His face went completely still. "What phone conversation?" "The one where you called me a stupid old bat and told Jessica about your 3-year plan to steal my money." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and what he should do about it. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. "Colder. Mom, you are clearly having some kind of breakdown. That conversation never happened. You are imagining things." "I am not imagining anything. You said I was becoming a problem because I was asking questions about the money. You laughed about how I believed your story about estate planning." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is exactly what I am talking about. These paranoid delusions, these false memories. Mom, you need professional help. I need help. You are the one who has been stealing from me for 3 years. I have not been stealing anything." He slammed his hand on the table, making me jump. "This money was always going to be mine eventually. I am just managing it more efficiently." There it was. The confession I had been hoping for. "Efficiently," I repeated. "Is that what you call stealing from your mother?" David sat back down and forced his voice to return to that reasonable tone. "Mom, do you have any idea what it costs to take care of an elderly parent? The medical bills, the assisted living facilities, the nursing home fees. Your savings would be gone in 3 years anyway. This way, we preserve the family wealth while making sure you get the care you need." Family wealth. My life savings had become family wealth that needed preserving. "Oh, care. You have not taken care of me. You visit once a month and call twice a week. That is not taking care of me." David's expression hardened. "I have been taking care of all your finances, making sure your bills get paid, managing your investments. Do you think that just happens by magic? You have been managing them right into your own bank account." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Mom, you are going to sign the papers I brought tonight. You are going to transfer the remaining accounts into my name. And you are going to do it willingly, or I will have you declared mentally incompetent. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. My own son was threatening to have me committed if I did not cooperate with his theft. You would do that to me. If you force me to. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder full of documents. I already have statements from your doctor about your declining mental state. I have witnesses who will testify that you have been confused and forgetful. It would not be hard to convince a judge that you can no longer manage your own affairs. What declining mental state? I have never been sharper in my life. Have you? You just told me you heard a phone conversation that never happened. You are making accusations about money that I have been legally managing for your own good. Those are signs of paranoid delusions, Mom. I stared at my son, this stranger wearing David face, and felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, that had already broken when I overheard his phone call. This was something deeper, the final severing of the bond that had connected us since the day he was born. No, I said quietly. No, what? No, I will not sign your papers. No, I will not let you steal what is left of my money. And no, I will not go quietly while you destroy my life. David's face flushed red with anger. You do not have a choice, Mom. I already control everything. I can declare you incompetent tomorrow. I can have you committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. I can make your life very difficult if you do not cooperate. I smiled then, probably for the first time since this nightmare began. David, there is something you should know. What is that? I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the digital recorder, still running. I have been recording our entire conversation. The color drained from his face as he stared at the small device. You cannot do that. That is illegal. Actually, it is not. Single-party consent state, remember? You taught me that when you were in law school. David lunged across the table, trying to grab the recorder, but I was faster. I clutched it to my chest and backed toward the phone. If you touch me, I will call the police right now. He stopped, his hands shaking with rage or fear or both. Mom, delete that recording right now. I do not think so. I think a lot of people would be very interested to hear you admit to stealing my money and threatening to have me committed. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not love, not even anger. Just cold calculation. This is not over, Mom. No, I agreed. It is just getting started. After David left, I sat in my kitchen shaking with adrenaline and terror and something that might have been pride. I had stood up to him. I had fought back. And I had the evidence to prove what he was doing. I called Patricia Williams' emergency number immediately. Mrs. Chen. How did it go? Got everything. He admitted to taking my money, to threatening me with commitment proceedings, to lying about my mental state. It is all on the recording. Excellent. Can you come to my office first thing tomorrow morning? We need to move quickly now that he knows you are aware of his actions. After I hung up, I realized David had been right about one thing. This was just getting started. And if he was desperate enough to threaten me with psychiatric commitment, there was no telling what he might do next. I double-checked all my locks and closed all the curtains. Then I sat down to wait for morning, and for the fight of my life to begin. The next morning brought gray skies and the kind of cold rain that seeps into your bones. I arrived at Patricia's office early, clutching the digital recorder like a lifeline. Everything I had left in the world depended on the conversation stored on this tiny device. Patricia listened to the recording twice, making notes as David's voice filled her office with admissions of theft and threats of forced commitment. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head. Mrs. Chen, this recording is devastating evidence. Your son has essentially confessed to financial elder abuse and criminal extortion. We can file charges immediately. What about his threats to have me declared incompetent? With this recording, those threats actually work in our favor. Any judge who hears David threaten to abuse the mental competency system to cover up his own crimes will see right through his manipulation. Patricia explained our legal options. We could file criminal charges for theft and elder abuse. We could petition the court to freeze all the accounts David had transferred. We could sue for full restitution of the stolen money. Most importantly, we could get a restraining order preventing David from having any contact with me. But I need to warn you again, Mrs. Chen. Once we file these charges, there will be no repairing your relationship with David. This will destroy your family permanently. I thought about the David I had raised, the little boy who used to make me breakfast in bed on my birthday. Then I thought about the man who had sat in my kitchen last night and threatened to have me locked away so he could steal the rest of my money. Mrs. Williams, that family was already destroyed. I was just too blind to see it. Then let us make sure justice is served. The legal process moved quickly once we had the recording. Patricia filed criminal charges against David for financial elder abuse, theft, and criminal coercion. We petitioned the court to freeze all accounts he had accessed and to reverse the property transfers he had forced through. Most satisfying of all, we requested a mental competency evaluation for me. I wanted it on record that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs, despite David claims otherwise. 3 days after we filed the charges, David called me. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message with Patricia present as a witness. Mom, his voice was strained and desperate. I know you think you are doing the right thing, but you are making a huge mistake. Call off your lawyer and we can work this out as a family. If you do not, I will be forced to take more drastic action to protect both of us. Patricia raised her eyebrows. Even his apologies sound like threats. We need to get that restraining order in place immediately. The temporary restraining order was granted that afternoon. David was prohibited from contacting me, coming to my house, or accessing any of my financial accounts. For the first time in months, I felt safe in my own home. But David was not finished with me yet. 2 days later, I answered my door to find 2 police officers and a woman in a business suit standing on my porch. Mrs. Chen. I am Detective Sarah Morrison. We need to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised about your welfare. My heart sank. David had found another way to attack me. What kind of concerns? Your son David contacted us yesterday. He claims you have been showing signs of dementia and paranoid delusions. He says you have accused him of stealing money that he has been legally managing for you. He is worried about your safety. I invited them inside, my mind racing. How was I going to convince these strangers that I was the victim here, not the confused old woman David was portraying me as? Detective Morrison was thorough in her questioning. She asked about my daily routine, my medical history, my relationship with David. The woman in the business suit turned out to be a social worker who specialized in elder welfare cases. Mrs. Chen, the social worker said gently, your son has provided us with some documentation suggesting that you signed over control of your finances to him several years ago. He claims you are now having regrets and making accusations because of confusion related to early-stage dementia. I looked at these well-meaning professionals who had come to check on a potentially vulnerable elderly woman, and I realized that David's scheme was even more sophisticated than I had thought. He had not just stolen my money. He had built an entire narrative to discredit me if I ever discovered his theft. Do you mind if I show you something? Yes. I played Patricia digital recorder for them, watching their expressions change as they heard David admit to stealing my money and threatening to have me committed. When it ended, Detective Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, when was this conversation recorded? 3 days ago in my kitchen. He came over to pressure me into signing more papers. And you recorded it legally. Single-party consent state. I was part of the conversation, so I had the right to record it. Detective Morrison exchanged glances with the social worker. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to have a very different conversation with your son. David was arrested the next morning at his office. The charges included financial elder abuse, theft of over $100,000, extortion, and filing a false report with police. His bail was set at $50,000, money I noted with bitter irony that he would have to pay with funds stolen from me. The local newspaper picked up the story. Son arrested for stealing from elderly mother. I was mortified to see our family drama spread across the front page, but Patricia assured me that the publicity would help our case. These crimes thrive in secrecy, she explained. The more people know about David's actions, the harder it will be for him to portray himself as a concerned son trying to help his confused mother. David attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit, tried every angle to discredit me. They claimed I was mentally incompetent, that I had willingly signed over control of my finances, that the recording was somehow doctored or taken out of context. None of it worked. The court-ordered mental competency evaluation showed that I was cognitively sharp and fully capable of managing my own affairs. The financial records clearly showed systematic theft over a period of 3 years. Most damaging of all was the recording, which captured David in his own words admitting to his crimes and threatening me. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I had to testify about the phone conversation I overheard about the missing money, about the years of manipulation and lies. It was agonizing to sit in a courtroom and catalog all the ways my own son had betrayed me. But the hardest moment came when David took the stand in his own defense. He looked directly at me as he spoke, his voice breaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. I love my mother more than anything in this world. Everything I did was to protect her, to make sure she would be taken care of as she got older. She was grieving after my father died, making poor financial decisions, forgetting important things. I was trying to help her preserve her assets so she would have security in her final years. Even knowing what I knew, even having heard his true feelings on that recording, part of me wanted to believe him. This was the David I remembered, the son who had held my hand at his father's funeral, who had promised to always take care of me. But then the prosecutor played the recording. David's voice filled the courtroom, cold and calculating as he admitted to stealing my money and called me a stupid old bat. The jury listened in shocked silence as he laughed about how easily I had believed his lies, how grateful I had been for his help in destroying my own financial security. When the recording ended, David was no longer looking at me. His head was down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The mask had finally fallen away completely. The verdict came back after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. David was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though he would likely serve only 18 months with good behavior. He was also ordered to pay full restitution of the stolen money, plus damages and court costs. The total came to over $250,000. As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. I expected to see anger or resentment in his eyes. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like relief, as if he was finally free of the burden of pretending to love me. The money was harder to recover than the court order made it seem. David had spent much of it on his house, his car, expensive dinners and vacations. Some had been invested in failed business ventures. What remained was tied up in assets that would take months to liquidate. But Patricia was relentless in pursuing every dollar. She worked with forensic accountants to trace the money, filed liens against David's property, and garnished his wages from the part-time job he managed to find after his release from prison. Slowly, painfully, I began to get my life back. The house deed was restored to my name. The bank accounts were transferred back to my control. I even received a formal apology from the police detective who had initially responded to David's false report about my mental state. But some things could never be repaired. The relationship with my son was over, destroyed by his greed and my refusal to remain a victim. The trust one had once placed so freely in people was gone, replaced by a hard-earned wariness that protected me but also isolated me. Most painful of all was the loneliness. Harold had been dead for 8 years, and now David was gone too, not to death but to something worse. I was truly alone in the world for the first time in my 71 years. The isolation nearly broke me. I spent weeks barely leaving the house, eating little, sleeping too much during the day and lying awake at night replaying every conversation with David and wondering how I had missed the signs of his betrayal. It was Ruth Patterson who finally shook me out of my depression. "Margaret Chen," she said, standing on my doorstep one Tuesday morning with a determined look on her face. "You are not going to waste away in this house feeling sorry for yourself." "I am not feeling sorry for myself," I protested weakly. "Yes, you are. And you have every right to feel sorry for yourself for a while. What David did to you was horrible and heartbreaking and completely unfair. But you cannot let his betrayal destroy the rest of your life. Ruth pushed past me into the house and looked around at the drawn curtains and pile of unwashed dishes. When was the last time you left this house for something other than a doctor appointment or court date? I could not remember. That is what I thought. Get dressed. We are going out. Ruth dragged me to lunch at a little cafe downtown, then to the community center where they were advertising volunteer opportunities. By the end of the afternoon, I had signed up to help with the literacy program for adult learners. It was exactly what I needed. Working with adults who were learning to read for the first time gave me purpose and reminded me that I had skills and knowledge that could help other people. The gratitude in their eyes when they mastered a difficult passage was worth more than any amount of money David could have stolen. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I made new friends among the other volunteers. I started taking classes at the senior center, learning watercolor painting and chair yoga. I even began dating again, having coffee with a widower named Frank who had also volunteered at the literacy center. Frank was nothing like Harold, but he was kind and funny and had his own story of family betrayal. His daughter had tried to pressure him into signing over his house after his wife died, though she had backed down when he threatened legal action. We understand each other. He told me one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. We know what it means to be disposable to the people who are supposed to love us most. Took 2 years for me to feel fully like myself again. 2 years to stop jumping every time the phone rang, worried it might be David calling from prison. 2 years to stop second-guessing every financial decision, afraid I was being naive or too trusting. But gradually, the sharp edges of the betrayal began to soften. I would never forget what David had done to me, but I refused to let his actions define the rest of my life. On a warm spring morning 3 years after David's arrest, I was working in my garden when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see a young woman getting out of a small sedan, holding the hand of a little boy who looked to be about 5 years old. My heart stopped. The woman had David eyes and Harold chin. She was tall and slender with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked nervous as she approached my front porch. "Mrs. Chen," she called out hesitantly. "My name is Lisa. I am David's ex-wife. This is Michael, your grandson." I stared at the little boy, seeing David's features mixed with those of a woman I had never met. David had been married. I had a grandson. How was this possible? "I am sorry to just show up like this," Lisa continued, seeing my shock. "I know about what happened with David, about the trial and everything. I wanted to reach out sooner, but my lawyer advised against it while the case was ongoing." "You have a lawyer?" Lisa nodded, still holding Michael's hand tightly. "David tried to do the same thing to me that he did to you. After we got married, he convinced me to put all our assets in joint accounts that he controlled. When I filed for divorce, I discovered he had emptied our savings and taken out loans against the house I had inherited from my parents. The familiar pattern made me sick to my stomach. David had not just targeted me because I was his vulnerable elderly mother. He had targeted anyone who trusted him enough to give him access to their finances. I fought him in court for 2 years, Lisa went on. I managed to get the house back and some of the money, but it was a nightmare. When I heard about what he did to you, I realized we were both victims of the same person. "Why are you here now?" I asked, not unkindly but wanting to understand. "Michael has been asking about his grandmother. David told him you were dead, but when he saw the newspaper articles about the trial, he started asking questions. I thought you should know that you have a grandson, and that not everyone in David's life was fooled by his lies." I looked down at Michael, who was staring at me with wide, curious eyes. "Are you really my grandma?" he asked in a small voice. "Yes," I said, kneeling down to his level. "I am really your grandma, and I have been wanting to meet you for a very long time." Over the following months, Lisa and Michael became regular visitors. I learned that David had been married to Lisa for 4 years before she discovered his financial manipulation and filed for divorce. She was a teacher like I had been, and she was raising Michael as a single mother while working 2 jobs to make ends meet. I also learned that Michael was nothing like his father. He was curious and kind, with an infectious laugh that reminded me of Harold when he was young. He loved books and puzzles and helping me in the garden. Most importantly, he had been raised to be honest and to treat other people with respect. Lisa had done an excellent job protecting him from David's worst influences. As Michael and I got to know each other, I began to understand something important. David's betrayal had taken many things from me. My money, my sense of security, my ability to trust easily. But it had not taken everything. I still had my intelligence, my independence, my capacity to love and be loved. I had new friends, new purposes, new reasons to get up in the morning. Most unexpectedly of all, I had a relationship with a grandson I never knew existed and a daughter-in-law who understood exactly what I had been through. On Michael's 6th birthday, I threw him a party in my backyard. Ruth and Frank came, along with several friends from the literacy center and neighbors who had become close to me over the past few years. Lisa brought a homemade cake, and Michael opened presents under the oak tree Harold had planted 30 years earlier. As I watched Michael laugh with the other children, I thought about the last birthday party I had hosted in this house. David's 38th, the night I overheard the phone conversation that changed everything. That night had been the beginning of the worst period of my life, but it had also been the beginning of my liberation. If I had not overheard David's true feelings about me, I might have spent the rest of my life as his victim. I would have signed over the last of my money, moved to whatever substandard care facility he chose for me, and died believing that my son loved me even as he was counting the days until my death freed up my assets. Instead, I had fought back. I had demanded justice. I had refused to be disposable. The legal battle had been exhausting and heartbreaking, but it had also taught me something valuable about myself. I was stronger than I had ever imagined. I could survive betrayal by the person I loved most in the world. I could rebuild my life from scratch at an age when many people had given up trying. Most importantly, I had learned that love is not the same thing as loyalty. David had claimed to love me while systematically destroying my life. Lisa barely knew me but had gone out of her way to give me a relationship with my grandson. The volunteers at the literacy center showed me more genuine care and respect than my own son ever had. Real love, I realized, is not about what people say or what roles they play in your life. It is about how they treat you when they think no one is watching, how they respond when you are vulnerable, whether they see you as a person with inherent worth or as an obstacle to their own desires. As the birthday party wound down and guests began to leave, Michael ran over to me with frosting on his cheek and excitement in his eyes. "Grandma Maggie, can I come help you in the garden again tomorrow?" "Course you can, sweetheart. We need to plant those tomatoes we talked about." He hugged me tightly, and I felt something I had not experienced in years. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The kind of happiness that comes from being loved simply for who you are, not for what you can provide. That night, as I cleaned up the party dishes and put away the leftover cake, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that terrible October evening 4 years ago. I had lost a son, but I had gained a grandson. I had lost my naivety, but I had gained wisdom. I had lost money, but I had gained independence. Most importantly, I had lost my fear. For too many years, I had been afraid of being alone, afraid of being a burden, afraid of standing up for myself. David had exploited those fears, using them as weapons to control and manipulate me. Now I knew the truth. Being alone was not the worst thing that could happen to me. Being taken advantage of by someone I trusted was much worse. Being seen as worthless by my own child was devastating. But surviving that betrayal and building a new life on the other side had given me a strength I never knew I possessed. I was no longer afraid of growing old alone because I was not alone. I had friends who chose to be in my life, not family members who felt obligated to tolerate me. I had people who valued my opinions, who sought out my company, who saw me as an asset to their lives rather than a burden to be managed. I had Frank, who brought me flowers and made me laugh and never once suggested that I was too old to make my own decisions. I had Ruth, who had literally saved my life by refusing to let me disappear into depression. I had Lisa, who could have easily kept Michael away from me but chose to share him instead. And I had Michael, whose love was the purest thing in my world. When he looked at me, he saw his grandmother who read him stories and taught him to plant seeds and made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. He did not see a burden or a bank account or a problem to be solved. He saw someone worth loving. David was released from prison after serving 14 months of his 3-year sentence. I learned about it from Patricia, who called to warn me in case he tried to contact me. The restraining order was still in effect, but she wanted me to be prepared. He has not made any attempts to reach out to you, she assured me. In fact, his parole officer says he has been completely compliant and seems focused on rebuilding his life. He found a job at an accounting firm and has been attending counseling sessions. I was glad to hear that David was getting help, but I felt nothing else about his release. No anger, no fear, no sadness. He had become a stranger to me, someone I had once known who had made choices that removed him from my life permanently. A few weeks later, Lisa told me that David had tried to contact her about seeing Michael. She had refused, pointing out that he had signed away his parental rights as part of their divorce settlement and that Michael barely remembered him anyway. I think he is trying to convince himself that he can fix what he broke, she said. But some things cannot be fixed. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive. I agreed with her, though I no longer felt bitter about it. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not the same thing as reconciliation. I had forgiven David in the sense that I no longer carried anger or hatred in my heart for him. But forgiveness did not require me to trust him again or to welcome him back into my life. He had shown me who he really was during those dark months of manipulation and theft. I chose to believe him. 5 years after that terrible birthday dinner, I celebrated my 76th birthday surrounded by people who genuinely loved me. Frank had proposed 6 months earlier, and we were planning a small wedding for the following spring. Michael, now 10 years old, was going to walk me down the aisle. As I blew out the candles on my cake, I made a wish. Not for David to come back or for our relationship to be magically healed. Those days were over. Instead, I wished for continued health and happiness, for more years of watching Michael grow up, for the wisdom to keep choosing people who saw my worth rather than my weaknesses. Looking around the table at the faces of my chosen family, I realized my wish had already come true. I had learned the hardest lesson life can teach. That sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most will hurt you deepest. But I had also learned something else. That surviving that kind of betrayal can make you stronger, wiser, and more capable of recognizing real love when it comes your way. David had taken my money, but he had not taken my spirit. He had broken my trust, but he had not broken my capacity to form new relationships. He had tried to make me disappear, but instead he had helped me find myself. I was no longer the naive, trusting woman who had hidden her son's financial abuse out of misplaced loyalty. I was someone who demanded respect, who stood up for herself, who refused to be anyone's victim ever again. And that woman, I realized as I looked around my birthday table, was someone worth celebrating. The last I heard of David, he had moved to another state and was working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. He had never married again, never had other children. Lisa heard through mutual acquaintances that he seemed isolated and alone, unable to form lasting relationships with people who knew his history. I did not take any satisfaction in his loneliness. It simply confirmed what I had suspected all along, that people who see others as objects to be used rather than individuals to be loved rarely find genuine happiness themselves. As for me, I was happier at 76 than I had been at 70. I had learned to value myself not for what I could give to others, but for who I was as a person. I had discovered that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who did not respect me. Most importantly, I had learned that it is never too late to start over, to demand better, to refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth as a human being. David had tried to make me disappear, to reduce me to nothing more than a source of money and a problem to be managed. Instead, he had forced me to become the strongest, most independent version of myself. In the end, I supposed I owed him a debt of gratitude. Not for his love, which had been false, but for his betrayal, which had been the catalyst for my transformation into someone I was proud to be. Someone who would never again be anyone's victim. Someone who had learned that the most important relationship you can have is the one with yourself. Someone who had discovered that growing old with dignity means refusing to be treated as anything less than the valuable, worthy person you have always been. That person was worth fighting for. And I was grateful every day that I had found the courage to do exactly that.